All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, December 17th, and I've been hearing people say that the German economy is collapsing. Is that an exaggeration?
You know, maybe it's sort of similar to the front line in Ukraine. Should we call it collapse or something else? I don't think we're at collapse yet, but we may be heading there. It is maybe crumbling. It is disintegrating. It is deindustrializing. I guess the latest figures show that industrial production is down 20% from 2019, from right before the pandemic, which is very considerable. They had quite a bit of had a few years to recover from the pandemic, and haven't. A Volkswagen plant in Dresden just shut down. First time that's ever happened to Volkswagen. Other plants are shutting down, relocating overseas to the U.S., and in some cases to China. That was serious. It's very serious. It maybe is on the verge of collapse. Let's put it that way.
Does the German government give an explanation why this is happening?
Yeah, well, the ruling parties, Chancellor Merz, point to the tariffs, and that certainly has an effect. The tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed on them, and there's no question that that's been a problem. I think other critics within the country tend to point to green policies, excessive regulation, and those are, causes of the industrial decline. But what almost no one talks about, I guess, is, aside from some people in the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht and her party, is no one talks about the impact of the sanctions, the economic war against Russia, and in particular the loss of cheap energy, which was most dramatically, let's say, symbolized or embodied in the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline.
But the German people know, right?
I don't know if they do. Some of them clearly do. And I think that's one reason why you get so much support for, first of all, the AfD and then Sarah Wagenknecht's party. I think those people know. And that's a considerable proportion of the population. We're talking about a third of the Germans. The others, there's still a lot of trust, residual trust in the government and the establishment. And a lot of people believe what they're told. And they're told, it has nothing to do with the sanctions. It has nothing to do with the loss of cheap energy. But that just seems so ridiculous. You have to just stop. I mean, everybody knows that if, let's say we're in a house and the energy bill goes up 25% or doubles or triples or whatever, hey, that's going to have an impact on our budget, right? On the household economy. Everybody understands that. So I don't, it's kind of hard to believe. I think everybody must know at some level that this is a problem, but they're told that, that's not really the problem. It's these other things. Don't look too hard at that. And though it seems incredible, I think you do have a lot of people that just, again, have this residual, confidence in the establishment. But clearly that's fading, and that's the reason why we have the rise of these alternative parties.
Right. So you mentioned tariffs, regulations, green energy, and then the big one that nobody talks about, the fact that they cut themselves off of cheap Russian energy. Do you know how much of the impact is coming from the cheap Russian energy? Is that the vast majority of it? It seems like it would be, right? Because this is a direct impact on your energy prices, which is the base input factor for everything, for all production.
Right. Well, of course, the green energy policies are having an impact on energy prices too, by forcing, because it introduces a logic that is not, let's say, practical and economic in nature. Certain forms of energy are privileged over others and not on a practical, economic basis. So there, that clearly is having an impact on the energy market too. But it's that's a job for an economist, and it'd actually be a very difficult task to measure exactly the impact of all these different things and to relate them to each other. I would say that in certain industries, I think, for example, the chemical industry is particularly dependent on cheap energy. And it just is no longer competitive without it. I think, you can point there and say that is a major factor. And it was competitive before 2022, was not competitive afterwards. Now they're talking about moving to China, setting up a plant which would be able to take advantage of cheap Russian energy.
Right. Well, I would just say that, Germany was able to pursue green energy because they had cheap Russian energy that allowed them to, have a less stable form of energy that they could invest in. But now that they cut themselves off, then, it's like, oh, we can't run our plants all with solar panels and wind farms, So
right.
That's the issue, right?
That's one way to look at it. It's certainly true. I think Germany was, and I think you have to say, still is a very prosperous society. It may not be a prosperous society 5 years from now, but it still is. But anyway, just up until a few years ago, it had, let's say there was a lot of margin for error. The system was overall so productive, and the German economy as a whole had so many resources that it could make mistakes. It could institute stupid policies and not really suffer the consequences. Maybe that's part of the problem, is that you get, when you achieve a certain level of prosperity, you are shielded from the consequences of your own stupid actions. We talked about this in an earlier podcast, I know. And so you start to commit more and more stupid acts. And I think that's what we've seen. So anyway, yeah, looking at it again, I understand the environmental arguments, and we don't have to get all into that. But just looking at it from a purely, cost-effective point of view, the green energy didn't make sense for German industry. But they could get away with it because they had these cushions. But now you've committed yet another stupid act. You've shut down German energy. I mean, the free, or not free rather, but cheap Russian energy. And the cushion that you had is gone, and now you're beginning to deindustrialize.
So we say that the German economy is crumbling, headed for a collapse. What entails an economic collapse, and do you think that's where we'll see it first in Europe? Will be in Germany, and then what effect will this have on the rest of the Europe, just the Western world in general?
Yeah, well, these things are very hard to predict. A collapse is just, again, it's just a sudden acceleration in a trend that there may be a trend. Sometimes, it could come out of nowhere. But I think in general, there's always a trend. There's some awareness that things are headed in the wrong direction, but you believe that it's manageable. Then there's a sudden acceleration, and you just lose control. The economy falls off a cliff, or, the battle lines in Ukraine just, it's just no longer can hold, and everybody just has to run. That's a collapse. Now, would it happen in the U.S. first or Europe? Again, these things are very difficult to predict. At present, Europe seems to be in more trouble than the U.S. is, and I think that's in good part because it was, first of all, much more integrated into the Russian economy. And so the economic war is having more of a negative impact. And it was certainly reliant to a great degree on cheap Russian energy, whereas the U.S. was not. Actually, the U.S. had really very minimal trade with Russia and is not entirely, but practically energy independent. It does have to import oil, but just not nearly as much. And it can import oil from other sources. So it was largely insulated from the effects of the economic war. Europe wasn't. So Europe is suffering. There are a number of major European economies that are entering into crisis. They suffering from long-term stagnation, recession, and fiscal, or bond crises, potentially in places like the UK and in France, that these are, right on the horizon now and could become real very soon.
Yeah, and when we say a collapse on the front line, it's easy to understand what that means. That it just okay, the line's broken, and then Russia's able just to steamroll forward. But I don't fully understand what it means when the economy collapses. Is it just one day everybody in Germany wakes up and it's like, uh-oh, my job doesn't exist anymore. It just every company's going bankrupt. I mean, what exactly happens? Oops, sorry. I think I may have said something close to Google, and it just started automatically.
I see.
AI assisting on my phone. So excuse me about that.
I see. Okay. Well, yeah, when you talk about a collapse, usually we're talking about something in the financial sector. Things move much faster within the financial sector than they do in let's say, the physical economy. So, but then these financial collapses, because again, you can have a run on the banks or the equivalent, in other financial institutions. It's just that so much depends on trust, and what you're dealing with is so liquid, is so easy to move, it's not like physical assets. You have a huge production plant. You can't just pick that up and send it over to China within a day. It takes time, right? So these things, the physical changes within the physical economy occur much more slowly. But within the financial economy, it can be almost instantaneous. It just said, okay, we parked our assets here because we have this certain assumptions about the long-term viability of this overall economy, and then one day, some major, let's say, institutional investors say we no longer have this confidence. We're moving out. They move out, and then others who are just kind of using them, say, well, this huge, these major institutional investors, they were here. That's why I'm here. I'm sure that they made the right decision. Hey, they're gone. And then everybody starts to run. And that's what happens in financial collapses. So that's, if you're going to look for a collapse, that's where it happens most quickly and where it's most likely to happen first. But then that has real impact on the physical economy. Then you don't have that in those funds available for investment for that the physical economy actually depends on to run, so it won't happen immediately. Like you're laid off on the first day, but maybe a year afterwards, if you're a worker at a plant that was, that has been affected by the financial collapse, you're going to lose your job then. I mean, that's how it works.
If something like this happens in Germany, Europe's a bit different because you have the Eurozone, you have the euro. You don't have countries don't have sovereign monetary policy. Like you don't have, they don't have the ability to devalue their currency, for example, to increase exports. So if this collapse happens in Germany, does it automatically spread to the rest of Europe? I mean, because it's all part of the same system.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly, Germany is by far the most important economy within the EU. It is the powerhouse of the EU. So what happens in Germany will certainly have an impact throughout the EU. How exactly that's going to play out, I can't be sure. The question of the euro, it is, I know that it can hurt actually in some ways. In some situations, it can have a negative impact on, let's say, smaller economies, which is all the other economies really. I remember like when the Greek fiscal crisis occurred, you say in the past, Greek had similar fiscal crises, but it had sovereignty and it was able to like devalue its currency and then get out of it. But they weren't able to do that. So there are situations where you want to have sovereignty and you don't have it and you're in a real bind. And then I think in general, a lot of countries like Italy and France, for example, used to export a lot more outside of the EU. But because once they adopted the euro, well, the euro was strengthened by, by Germany's position, the dominant position within the EU economy. And so in essence, their currency was overvalued because they were now using the German-backed euro, and many of their products became uncompetitive on foreign markets. So that's the problem. Now, if Germany collapsed, that would lead to a weakening of the euro, so it might help as far as exports go, but there are going to be a lot of other negative consequences.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about and talk about because when was the last time we've had like a true economic collapse in the Western world? It's been a long time, right?
Yeah, I mean, we had a very serious downturn, of course, in 2008.
That should have been the collapse, but we prevented the collapse by printing a ton of money.
Right, exactly. So we got out of that. It was a sharp recession is what it was. I mean, if you want to go to a real collapse, then you have to go back to the Great Depression. I think that's what, where things fell apart and they weren't put back together for more than a decade, and that was only following a world war.
Yeah, that's like 100 years ago. I mean, do you think that's what...
Yeah, we're getting close to that 1929, right? It was when the stock market collapsed,
Right. And so do you think that's what we might, we're due for something like that? That's what we could potentially be looking at? Because it's just something that I just hear in history. I don't really understand what it fully means. Like, it just seems like we have these bubbles that pop, and then all of a sudden we engage in our Keynesian, expansionary monetary policies, and then print our way out of it, and then everything starts to get a little bit more expensive for people. We deal with inflation, but that's just been the process. And I'm just, and then I think that we talk about there's going to be eventually. You can't do that forever. There has to be a collapse, but it just seems like it hasn't happened in 100 years. I just, I'm like,
right. There are two different things going on here. I mean, and like the challenges that Europe faces are different from those that the U.S. economy faces. So in Europe, they are faced with a stagnation, these increasing energy costs and all the other problems that we talked about. And then I think these are maybe all problems that can be solved. Again, Europe is really quite prosperous. It has a lot going for it. It has a lot of resources. It could turn things around. But the thing is, you look at the leadership, and they're not doing anything to fix problems. They're all a bunch of, just dim-witted ideologues, and they're doubling down on their mistakes, for example, vis-a-vis Russia, but also virtually everything else. And so the outlook for Europe, I would say, is grim. It's not necessarily true that they'll enter into, we don't know that there will be a collapse. Maybe what Europe is faced with is something like what Japan is experiencing. Japan was just a real rising star. I remember up through the 80s, and there was a sense that Japan was just going to, completely demolish the U.S. I mean, there was a real fear of that back then. That Japan was an unstoppable force, and then they had their own, fiscal crises, and they never really got out of it. Now, Japan is still a prosperous place. It's very prosperous, but it really has stopped growing. And it stopped growing for not just a few years, but, it's been experiencing stagnation for decades now. And now I think it's actually turning into a crisis. I mean, I think that there are certain accumulated problems, the huge debt that they have and so forth, that is maybe going to lead to a crisis. But it didn't happen all at once. They entered into this period of stagnation, and maybe we'll see something similar for Europe. But again, just looking at the leadership and the decisions they're making, it's not, rather than reaching a settlement with Russia and then, beginning to work with them again. Russia was obviously so important to their economy on so many different levels. It's not just cheap energy, but it's just, this is the largest country in Europe, and you've cut them out, and you pretend that they're just a gas station masquerading as a country. It's nonsense. It's obviously a great technological power and industrial power, and it's really proved those things through this war. And you cut yourself off from it. It doesn't make any sense. Any economic sense whatsoever. And then rather than, achieve some sort of cooperative relationship with them, the Europeans seem to be pushing hard, with this, not the reindustrialization of Europe, but the rearmament. And that just, that doesn't make any kind of economic sense. That's actually just a further diversion of resources to something that's non-productive and that they don't need. So anyway, it looks grim for Europe. We don't know if there's going to be a collapse. These kind of things but I think at the very least, there's going to be an extended period of stagnation. And there may again, because of just an accumulation of stupid policy decisions. And right now we're talking about the Euroclear issue, right? That right there is just yet another, stupid, just piling one stupid act upon another that's going to hurt the economy of Europe. So that's Europe anyway. Let's just set that aside. But the U.S. has some different issues. I mean, overall, its current economic health rate of growth, looks better than Europe. and that's been true for the last few years. However, the U.S. does have this huge debt. It has really relied on the dollar, its status as a world reserve currency, to actually just ignore fiscal common sense. In other words, we've stopped trying to balance the budget, and we've just had, we have these huge deficits. Now, Europe actually can't do that. They are dealing with some excessive debt, but it's actually, in a way, it's good that they're forced to deal with it, because they can't just print money the way that we can. We keep on printing money, and that's actually taking us into increasingly dangerous waters. There was this assumption that, everybody needs dollars, so it doesn't matter. We can just keep on printing them. They have to buy them up. And for a long time, that was true. When there was no alternative to the U.S. dollar, countries around the world, they all traded using dollars. And because they did, just banks throughout the world had to have a lot of dollars in reserve to carry out these trades. But that's changing. And we know in large part because of the Ukraine war and the sanctions on Russia. So countries are moving away and discovering that they don't need to depend on dollars. And we see it. These major investors, 25% of U.S. debt is held by foreigners. So this is a major portion. And it's that 25% that allows the U.S. to keep on printing money, without having to raise rates. When you raise your rates on the debt, the way people buy U.S. dollars, or other countries, other central banks buy U.S. dollars, is they buy the bonds. So they're buying our debt is what they're doing. And it's just because they needed those dollars in the past, we didn't even have to pay them anything for it, which means, in other words, they didn't get really any return on it, any very, very low yields on those debts. But as the foreigners move out, like China, which is happening in a significant way, everything starts to change, and we start to have to pay attention to the normal economic or financial realities that other countries have to pay attention to. We do need to start, we can't just assume people are going to take our bonds anymore, buy our debt. So we have to actually offer them something. In other words, we got to start raising these rates. And then that's what we see happening. The pressure to do that is already there, and it's starting to happen. And that can just take us, because we have such a huge debt that, as a consequence of this reckless spending over the years, over the decades, that can just explode. And then we could find ourselves, you talk about a collapse, we really could have a collapse in this country. Again, it's just very hard to predict these things. People have been talking about this for many, many years, but I think the signs are that we are finally getting close. We really are, because we see the movements taking place. It used to be that no matter how stupid our policies were, and, even during the 2008 crisis, which started here because of bad policies in this country, still everybody rushed to buy dollars. That's just not happening anymore. And so we maybe see the beginning of the end, right, for the dollar-based system.
Mm. With the Euroclear thing, do you expect there to be some immediate repercussions if and when Ursula von der Leyen gets her hands on it, if the EU is able to do it? Do you expect that immediately countries like China will be like, okay, we're out, give us our money back, we're no money in Europe?
It's possible. It's also possible that we might not see much at first. One thing that we will see is, I think it was like the Fitch rating agency just announced, this is in addition to all these other kind of banks and so forth, that they actually put Euroclear on a watch list. It's just that if they go down this road that Ursula von der Leyen and the others want them to go down, to seize these Russian assets, this rating agency is going to lower their rating. So that would be an immediate consequence, and that's going to hurt them. That's obviously going to be an impediment to a very, very large business. Now it's okay. We could see we'll see some immediate consequences like that, but it might not be all that much. And you might get this thing, well, see, all those scaredy cats, everybody, they were Chicken Little saying the sky was going to fall down, and we did it, and there's no problem. We crossed another one of these so-called red lines. It doesn't matter. But a lot of these decisions are made over aren't made immediately. It'll be a year from now, 2 years from now. Look where they are 5 years later, and I think there's just no question that you're going to see the consequences. That this act is going to contribute to the maybe in the short term, but definitely the long-term decline of the European economy.
Yeah, these economic questions they're fascinating for me. I want to see it happen just because just to satisfy my own curiosity. Like, what does this mean when they seize these assets, and what an economic collapse means? Because I realize that we don't know much about the economy. So much is just based on like a single historic event. And then that we just build everything off of that, like the Great Depression 100 years ago. We just assume like, okay, well, this is the main event that we had of economic collapse. And then we just extrapolate from there, and we just assume like, okay, well, let's draw on that. But really, we don't know.
Yeah.
And so I want to see what's going to happen. And it just, the conditions are just so strange now with, the interconnected economy, the EU, the fact that we have this war going on, the U.S. is a dollar reserve, and just like, Merz in his government, they seem to be serious about talking about war with Russia, but at the same time, their economy is crumbling. So are they really serious about war? I mean, how can they square that away? Like, okay, hey, everybody, we're closing down Volkswagen plants. People can barely afford to heat their homes. You guys ready for war? Let's go. It's just like, how does that work?
I don't know. Again, it's kind of, I don't really have an answer because it just doesn't make any sense. But we have seen some very overheated, really extreme rhetoric from these European leaders over the last few days. I think it was a French, there was a French military chief. I can't remember exactly what his position was within the French military, but a leader of the French military that said that, the Europeans would have to prepare to sacrifice their children, for a coming war. And then we had Rutte say that, we have to prepare for something, making sacrifices even greater than we did in World War II. I mean, just extraordinary statement. And then there's the new head of MI5 and in Britain, and then also the military chief of staff in Britain too, making the same kinds of very extreme statements. Like, we have to prepare to mobilize our entire society. I think the head of the MI5 was saying basically we're at war with them. That Russia's attacking us, with this hybrid war. Apparently every drone has been launched by a Russian, though nobody's ever shown any evidence that any of them are. But so I don't know, this is in their fevered imaginations. But again, there's sort of a huge gap between the rhetoric and the reality. If you really believe that, if you really think that you're just like, you're going to be in World War III in 5 years, why aren't you only allocating like 2.5% of your, GDP to the military? And now they're talking about moving it up to 5%. But still, if you're really thinking about, you really believe there's going to be World War III, you should be mobilizing the society. It should be, 10, 20%. It should be so there's just this, I don't know, and at one level, they don't seem to have a real firm grasp of reality. I think they kind of like striking these poses. And I think they imagine that they're Churchillian when they do that. But it doesn't seem to be based in any reality. And I don't, maybe at some point these words are going to be backed up with real actions. We're going to see a huge, increase in military budgets and so on and so forth, and mass conscription and that kind of thing. So far, like when they try to propose that, I think within Germany, Merz wants to do institute conscription there, and the common people are not interested, is my understanding. Now, maybe they're going to eventually scare them enough that you're going to get to mobilize European society, but we're not seeing that right now, not at all. And by the way, just when you're talking about that, even right now, it's amazing. Russia actually cut its military budget for next year. So again, there's all this talk that Russia is going to invade all of Europe. If Russia was really planning to invade all of Europe, why are they cutting their military budget when they're actually in a war? I think it's like they got things up and running to the point. There's a lot of initial funds that need to be allocated to get plants built and so on, but the plants have been built so they can actually reduce their expenditures somewhat. I think it's at like roughly 6.5% of their GDP. If you look at the amount that Russia's spending compared to what all of NATO is spending, it's almost like 10%. So again, it's just like obviously the Russians get a lot more bang for their buck, and the Russian, again, NATO's talking about these very large increases, even though they are already spending so much more. And they just don't seem to get much for it. But
so if that's the case, then are you saying that like Germany's military budget is the same as Russia's right now, or do you know these numbers, or maybe even larger?
I think Russia is about 6.5% of their GDP. Now, okay, in GDP terms, of course, Russia is smaller than Germany. In the more meaningful purchasing power terms, Russia's economy is larger than Germany's. I think Germany hasn't reached the 5%. They were down around 2%. They may be, I don't know. I'm just going to guess like a 3%, but Merz wants to keep on raising that.
Well, I mean, the reason they can't raise it, I'm sure they would love to get it to 10, 20%, be able to conscript. But like you said, it just they can't convince the people. So that's what's constraining them. So they can talk all they want, all this rhetoric about preparing for war with Russia. But if they're not able to give out a convincing enough narrative.
Exactly. They're going to have to succeed in scaring or convincing their people that it's necessary. But again, we just see with the whole Euroclear issue that they can't, they're, again, as I pointed out, they're doing this because they know they can't convince their people to cough up this money. We're just talking this would be a small fraction of what you would have to sacrifice for an actual World War III, but they can't get them to do that. They know they can. So that's why they're trying to steal the money. That's what it comes down to.
Okay, well, that's good then, right? Then that means we shouldn't be able to...
Right, let's pin at least, maybe the common sense you might want to say, or the apathy of the common European person. That's what we got to, I think we can place some confidence in that. Maybe not common sense, but just apathy. It's like, if they're going to invade, let them invade. I don't want to fight.
Yeah. Well, just continue with the Russia-Ukraine thing. I mean, right now, this peace plan that's supposedly being tossed around, it sounds like it's just a conversation that's between Ukraine, the United States, and the European leaders. And they can't, just between them, they can't settle on anything. And then, of course, you did not including the most important player, Russia, who is winning the war and therefore gets to dictate the terms. They're just ignoring. The whole thing is just a clown show. And we talk about this over and like, why is this happening? Why are they going on? Why are they doing this? What are these leaders doing? It's just the insanity of this. It's like, what is happening? We can't even agree something between us here in the West, and whatever we agree on isn't going to be palatable for the Russians who get to decide anyway. So,
well, they may end up agreeing. It seems to me that and this always happens, is that, the Trump administration is caving in and has pretty much agreed to everything, so they're back to where they were before. And with that 28-point plan, they had moved towards the Russian position, but they weren't there yet. They weren't meeting Russia's demands, but they were moving in that direction. But now, from if the reports that we're getting from Berlin and other places are true, they have basically walked it all back, and they have acceded to Zelensky's demands. There's something out there, there's some story that apparently that Zelensky made this huge concession. He said, okay, we don't have to be in NATO, but that's just nonsense for a couple of reasons. First, it's not okay. He concedes that maybe they can't get NATO membership right away in the near future. It may take some time. Well, that's not going to satisfy the Russians. 3 years here in NATO, that's not something that they can let happen. But then also they're asking for security guarantees in the meantime that are Article 5 equivalent. And so then what's the whole point? If you actually have it's all NATO except in name. it's de facto NATO. And so why would the Russians, accede to that? So he's made no concessions. It's clear to me that that Zelensky has made no concessions whatsoever. I guess another thing that it strikes me and that nobody seems to bring up is saying that, okay, the Russians are demanding this. They don't want NATO in Ukraine. They don't want these security guarantees, because what you do is you have a trigger for World War III. Something happens. And let's be honest, it's just that there could be a false flag. It could be a Ukrainian attack, but then it's just spun the other way. This was the reason. This is like what Lavrov said. It's like we were looking at this and we could see, okay, NATO was angling to make that's your dog right there. Anyway,
yeah.
To make Ukraine a member, and with Ukraine as a member of NATO. Well, that would mean that, and in the same time, Ukraine was insisting on taking these territories, taking back all of the Donbass and Crimea, and was clearly building up a military to do that. And so, we can have actually an attack, is where they insist that they're taking back their own territories, and they'll say that this, and then when we respond to that, they can invoke Article 5 and we're in World War III. We just couldn't let this happen. So this would take them put them in the same position, right? If we get this basically de facto Article 5 kind of arrangement. But okay, so from the Russian point of view, you see why they don't want it. You have this trigger for World War III right on their own border. But from the American side too, say, do you really want to have this trigger, in this country that's thousands of miles from you, and is not, it's actually a poor, corrupt country that is not in any way could possibly be conceived of as some sort of essential ally or essential to your own security. Do you want to create this, this trigger wire there? So where you're forced to come in and fight the Russians and engage in World War III if things go wrong. And there are a lot of ways, it's always pictured like there'll just be this outright Russian invasion. But you know how things can start. It can be very, very messy and very murky. And then, how everything will be spun. There could be false flags or whatever. You want to set things up so where things go wrong, okay, the U.S. has to fight World War III. Isn't that stupid from our own point of view? Why should we do that? But it seems like nobody even questions that. It's just sort of, why wouldn't we do that? Well, but apparently from what I've heard is that, Trump seemed to be reluctant to do that. But it sounds like they ended up actually agreeing to that, providing some sort of firm security guarantee like that, which again, is just very foolish from our own point of view. It's not just from the Russians.
Right, so we might actually sign some type of security guarantee with Ukraine, an Article 5 type of deal like that. You think that's possible?
I don't think we're going to sign it, because this is supposed to be part of a package that will be presented to the Russians. So we're not offering to sign it with Ukraine now, but we're saying that if the Russians agree to this, then we'll sign and we'll make this promise.
Yeah, but we know the Russians aren't going to agree.
Yeah,
so
they're not.
It's not going to go anywhere.
Right. Yeah, but I'm just pointing out that, even you have no matter how you look at this, that these negotiations, so-called, within Europe just don't make any sense.
Do you think that maybe the U.S. is just say, okay, fine, we'll throw it in and then we'll present it to the Russians and we know the Russians will reject it. And then that was look, sorry, we can't do it. You got, do you think that's the plan?
I don't think so. I think it's just look, Trump, every time he gets into these kind of negotiations, he always has this real positive spin. He's really optimistic. It looks like we're going to close a deal next week or something, right? We've heard this again and again. And apparently back in Alaska, he had told, back then the Russians had, or the Americans had actually agreed to a lot of the Russian demands. We don't know specifically what they were. We can make some guesses, but they had agreed to them. And Trump, according to people present at the meeting, had said that, okay, yeah, he was confident that he could persuade Zelensky to agree to them too. And say, okay, so we understand, we have this understanding. Okay, this is what we're offering. You're agreeing to it. You're going to get the Ukrainians to agree to it as well. Great. Well, it never happened. And now, we know some of the crazy things, the phone call and whatever, and the proposed Budapest meeting and all that happened in the meantime. But now, where was Zelensky? And it looks like rather than getting Zelensky to agree to the Russian positions, Trump has actually gone all the way back, and he's told, according to some reports, I think it was Bloomberg, that Trump was confident that he could persuade the Russians to agree to the Ukrainians. It's just Trump, he's always just so sure of his own ability to persuade. He likes, giving a positive spin to all these things. But he has to, if you make an agreement, you really promise the Russians something, you got to stick by it, stick to your guns. Actually, again, the Americans, at least theoretically, have the leverage. They do have the leverage to make it stick. But you have to stick to your guns. You can't get in and, start negotiating down to nothing. I think the part of the problem is Trump himself. Like I've said, he's just got this personality. He talks to one person, he agrees with them. I'm all on your side. He talks to the other person, and he's just, he's gone back and forth on this. This is not the first time that Zelensky has persuaded him to retreat from the Russian demands. Remember, there was that meeting with the maps that were thrown around and everything. Apparently, at the end of that meeting, Trump agreed to him, agreed with Zelensky. So it's just like who's the latest person he's talked to? I've heard that for years, and it really seems to be true. So, you have this problem with Trump himself as an individual. But then you also have the problem that he has a divided administration. There are some people that really are ready to meet the Russian demands. It seems to be true, like Witkoff and maybe Vance and a few others. But then a lot of people within the administration, and I'm sure the vast majority within the deep state and within both political parties, are on the other side of this. So even if he was disciplined himself, it's just very, very doubtful that he could get this through.
Do you see any concrete actions being taken from the West that will be, a significant development in the war, like NATO troops or some increased weaponry or something? Or do you just imagine that we're in the stage where it's just bickering and infighting and flip-flopping within the West as the ship is sinking? They're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic type of scenario, right. And nothing is really going to happen, and Russia's just going to be like, all right, we'll just keep doing our thing, and you guys keep on fighting,
right?
And then one day they'll wake up and it's over.
Yeah. Basically, I've been ignoring the sideshow in Berlin and other places because the whole thing is just so absurd. Occasionally I'll check in and see what's going on, but it obviously is just meaningless. Like you say, it's just deck chairs on the Atlantic, and I don't care where the deck chairs are.
On the Titanic.
Oh, the Titanic. I'm sorry. Thank you. So, yeah, I think that's probably right. That's what we're seeing now, and we'll probably continue to see that, and we'll get a lot more of this overheated rhetoric, and it'll go on and on. But nobody's actually going to put troops on the ground for now. But when there really is a collapse, we're not there yet. But it could be next month. It could be a year from now. I don't know. When there really is a collapse. And the Russians are maybe marching on Odessa, they've crossed the Dnieper, they've taken Zaporozhye, then it's just like the hysteria is going to go up to a whole new level, and they just might do something really crazy like that. You can't say that they wouldn't, because they are just so, so insane. They just might.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing we talked about, the economic collapse. The thing that's constraining them is their own people. Like, why can't they get those zero clear assets? They want to seize it, but they can't do it. I just don't think they'll be able to.
Well, in this case,
off.
It's actually, it's not the people who are stopping them from. They're looking at the Euroclear assets because they know they can't get it directly from the
right. Yes, right. You can't get it from the people, like you're saying.
Right.
So they're looking at stealing it, and so. Yeah, I just don't think they'll be able to pull it off, right? I mean, I think they will just be bickering and fighting until the whole thing collapses, and they'll destroy they'll probably end up stealing the assets, destroying the economy, and then they're just going to destroy their country and fighting the whole time. I don't think they'll ever send troops. I just don't think they're capable. There would be a revolt, right?
Yeah. Well, I hope so. I have reason. Again, what makes me hopeful is, again, the apathy and a certain amount of common sense among the ordinary people in Europe, and the weakness in general of their militaries. So, that's what we're pinning our hopes on. And it's real. That weakness is real. That apathy is real. And it just may be an immovable, a barrier that the leadership cannot overcome. Yeah. So let's hope that that's it. And maybe there's just some little kind of small corner of their brains where they say, oh, we do this, it's World War III. That would be bad. Let's not do that. And they'll just stop, right there at the edge of the cliff, at the precipice.
Yeah, I think we might see Russia just continue to move forward until there's a real change in behavior amongst the European population. We're just saying that, if they take Odessa, for example, we say they start marching on Odessa, that the elite will go crazy. But if the everyday people are still like, well, yeah, that's traditionally a Russian city, we don't care, it doesn't bother them, then I think Russia will be able to take it. And there's not a lot that Europe could do. And it just depends, like if they march on forward to Kiev, for example, then at that point, will people in Europe start to get scared? And then if that's what they need. It's almost like I think that the what Merz and Starmer and Macron need, I think they need to see the Russians going deeper than they should be going. And then that can maybe start to instill the fear, like, look, now it's coming, they're coming for us now. I think that's what they're hoping for, right?
Yeah, well, that's right. And it just might work. It's just, so far it hasn't worked. I mean, I guess you find opinion polls, maybe like concern about Russia has gone up, but opinion polls, will show it's easy to give an answer of yes or no, but how are you going to back it up? Are you then willing to spend, to sacrifice a quarter of your income for this? And then everybody says no, so it's just, so far, I don't think they've made any significant inroads into public opinion. There are just certain states that have always been kind of unhinged, like the Baltic states. But when you get out of them, you just don't find that. There is no readiness to go to war with Russia. And in fact, there were some opinion polls that came out recently that showed in both France and Germany, so the two most important countries in Europe, the opinion was actually swinging against providing support to Ukraine. So there was like the percentage of people that were in favor of reducing support to Ukraine was significantly larger than those, that actually wanted to increase it. And then, interestingly, in the U.S., there's actually a slight plurality in favor of increasing it. It's not very large, but there, you find some. And I guess, I think if you really talked about real numbers, you might find that there's not a willingness to cough up very much, but there is some willingness to increase spending on behalf of Ukraine or in support of Ukraine in this country and in Canada and the UK, but not in France and Germany. It's actually moving the other direction. So far they're not, Chancellor Merz and President Macron are not having success, in spite of all their efforts to scare their populations, their populations are saying, no, let's cut the money. We don't want more money going to Ukraine. We want less money going to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I asked you this before, if you thought that Russia would take Kiev, and there were some people that left a lot of comments saying that, well, Kiev is a Russian city. Is that true? Is Kiev historically a Russian city?
Well, historically, if you go into deep history, it's Kiev Rus. That's actually where Russia began. So it is like the cradle of Russia in a lot of ways. But if you, in more recent history, it's. I think you have to say it's like part of the borderlands. And by the way, Ukraine actually means border or borderland, where it has been really between, the West and Russia. And as at various times it's been under the control of one side or the other over the last few hundred years. So it is, I'm pretty confident. I haven't seen the figures, but I think the majority of the speakers are Russian speakers. I mean, the majority of the people there are Russian speakers. Now, being a Russian speaker doesn't mean that you necessarily identify with Russia, but it means obviously you have a strong connection to Russia. There's no question about it. So it's part of that central part of Russia that is not really, is not like the Lvov and the Western Ukraine, which used to be Galicia, used to be part of Poland. It was often it was a part of Poland in the past, and where people do speak, a significantly a different dialect. You might call it a different language. That's kind of a political question, but much less so in Kiev. So Kiev is a kind of place that can go either way. That does have sort of mixed loyalties, or it's not like the Donbass and southern Russia, which has always been very, for as long been, hundreds of years. The Odessa by itself, for example, was established by Catherine the Great. They have long been, looked to Russia, have been part of Russia, for most of that time. In fact, I saw some discussion, maybe it was in the blog Events in Ukraine, which is a fascinating blog. Again, I would recommend it for its discussions on politics and life within Ukraine, or it may have been elsewhere. I'm not sure, but there was the question was raised. It's like, why are the Ukrainians? Why is Zelensky so concerned about Kupiansk? And why did they actually pull troops from other places and send them to Kupiansk and launch all these counterattacks, which it seems clear to me have, largely failed, like they always do. Maybe they have temporary successes, but they're only temporary. Why did he bother to go there or pretend to go there and, have his picture taken outside of the city? And, in the meantime, there is so little concern for what's happening in the southern Donbass, or even farther south in Zaporozhye, right? This is there. If there's any place where a collapse is occurring, it's there in the Zaporozhye region, in Guliopole and surrounding areas. And instead of sending those troops there to stabilize the line, they've in fact pulled some off, from what I understand. And what this blog said is that within Ukraine, there's a sense that, okay, those places really are Russian. They don't even want us to be there. We know that. It probably just as good. A certain number, that's not what the government is saying, but this is what people on the streets say. Just let the Russians take that, because those people, they always were Russians. They didn't really want to be with us. It's probably just as well, which would have been wise if years ago you just kind of agreed to an amicable divorce, right? But now some people are talking like that within Russian society, or not Russian society, but Ukrainian society. Now, Kharkov actually, again, is, I think, no question about it, is majority Russian speaking. But the Russian identity is not as strong there, and it's closer to Kiev. And there's this sense that it's scarier for the people in Kiev, and they say, that they've already resigned themselves to the fact that the Russians are going to take those oblasts in Donbass and in the south. But there still is some sense that we need to hang on to Kharkov. This is part of Ukraine. At least this is what some Ukrainians think, or many more think than they do, as opposed to the Donbass. So there is if you look at, for example, elections prior to 2014, Kharkov would always go for the pro-Russian party, but the majority wouldn't be as strong as it was in the Donbass or in Odessa. So there's just kind of degrees of let's say loyalty or identity, within these central oblasts. No question Kharkov is Russian-leaning, but it doesn't lean as strongly as the Donbass or Zaporozhye. There's no question there are a lot of people within Kiev who think of themselves as Russian, or if not, at least, have always looked to Russia as kind of a part of their identity. No question, exactly. But it's, again, it's definitely mixed in a place like Kiev. Now, these things can change, it's just like the outcome of the war. If there's a real decisive Russian victory, there might be one possible outcome is that the people will say, okay, that whole Ukraine experiment, support for Zelensky and for these ultranationalists, that was stupid. That didn't work. Hey, Mariupol's looking pretty good. Maybe Kiev would do better under the Russians. And you conceivably, I don't know that this is possible, but conceivably that could happen.
Okay, so do you think Russia will take Odessa?
Yeah, and I'm more confident of that than I was before, because of the attacks on tankers.
Mm.
which is something I pointed out back then. It was just that it was a further reminder, I think the Russians probably already understood that, because, for example, so many of these drones had already come out of that, not just Odessa, but the entire, southern coast, and had made the Black Sea a dangerous place, for both civilian and naval vessels. And so I think that because of these recent events, they realize if they didn't realize it already, they certainly realize it now. If they don't have that southern coast, they're always going to be vulnerable to sea attacks from Ukraine.
Do you see this happening in the not too distant future? I mean, we've talked about Ukraine is in this crumbling state, the talk of collapse. So, I mean, when that happens, you imagine that Odessa could fall pretty quickly. And then if it falls quickly, we see the reaction from the West. If they're not able to really do anything, then maybe Russia has the confidence in what they go to for Kharkov next. And then after that, it could be Kiev, right? And then if you take those three cities, that's Ukraine's over, right? I mean, Kharkov and Kiev, those are the two biggest cities. Kharkov, Kiev, and Odessa, those are the three largest ones, right? I think. I don't know.
No, I don't think Odessa is number 3, but Kiev is number 1. And
Kharkov is number 2.
Number 2. And maybe like Dnipropetrovsk, that's another one that actually the Russians could take in the not so distant future, actually probably sooner than Odessa. That might be number 3. I'm not quite sure, but that might be number 3. Yeah.
Okay, well, so anyway.
I think it's close to 1 million.
Russia will take all of the largest cities, the wealthiest in terms of mineral value and manufacturing power as well, like and the Black Sea coast. Then can Ukraine survive without those cities? Like, I mean, or would it just be partitioned and be like, okay, Hungary, you get some, Poland, you get some, everybody takes a piece.
Well, it could survive, but it obviously is going to be a much smaller and poorer country than it would have been otherwise. I think there's no question about it. It just it will have lost the vast majority of its industry and natural resources and very important access to the sea. It'll be like a Moldova, it'll be a small kind of backwards European country. It could, if it settled down and actually established, a stable system and just, ceased to gave up its anti-Russian dream, it could eventually prosper. It would never be a great or powerful country. That wouldn't ever happen, but it could be a decent place to live. But the thing is, like, the kind of people that are going to run it most likely are going to be, the Banderites, and it's just going to always be just a festering sore in Europe. That's the fear anyway, I think, and a very reasonable fear.
Yeah. I mean, being a landlocked country isn't necessarily doom. I mean, you think about places like Switzerland, for example, a neutral country. It's very small, very powerful, a lot of clout because of its neutrality status, although that has been wavering.
Did
you hear that Colonel Jacques Baud's been sanctioned?
Yeah, no, I did. And recently another Swiss citizen was sanctioned. Actually, she's half African. And it's because apparently she expressed opinions quite regularly in favor of Russia's involvement in Africa, and so she's been sanctioned. And these sanctions are quite severe. They involve restrictions on travel, the seizure of assets, and other restrictions. Actually, I don't know exactly how far they go, but I think different institutions and so on and so forth can no longer deal with you. I don't know what that exactly means, but we're talking about something much more than symbolic, much more than a slap on the wrist. I mean, this was done again without a trial. These people were never allowed to defend themselves in court in any way. They've been slapped. They're the subject of these very, very severe restrictions. And it's not just them. We're talking about Switzerland, but there are many other individuals throughout Europe that have been subject to the same.
Do you think that stuff like that will happen here in the U.S.? That we could, I mean, I just wonder how. I think if it is going to happen in the U.S., I think it's going to come more on the anti-Semitism part.
Well, I guess that's where it is happening, if anywhere in the U.S.
Right.
We do have stronger freedom of speech guarantees historically, both on paper and in practice in the U.S. than Europe has in general. These are just the latest examples of a kind of a growing repression within Europe. In both Germany and UK, for example, people get arrested or detained all the time for posting, incorrect opinions on the internet. And it's amazing to me that, these various civil rights organizations and human rights organizations always look the other way. It's okay when Europeans, because those are the right kind of enemies, apparently, So, it's a growing trend within Europe. In this country, we saw, things have changed now that Trump's in charge. And like you say, it's now kind of the focus on efforts to suppress dissident opinions is taken on a Zionist hue. So we find, universities under attack, that are not towing the Zionist line. And there's a real chilling effect. Professors that teach the wrong things can actually, be subject to various kinds of sanctions within these universities. Problem is, so many of these universities are really dependent on federal funds, so the federal government can really force them to do all kinds of things, which they might not, even want to do. In some cases, I think a lot of these administrators are happy to do it, to impose, these sanctions on professors and on students and so on and so forth. But of course, under Biden, we were seeing something different. There was this collaboration between the federal government and various platforms like Twitter, exposed by Matt Taibbi and others, very, very thoroughly. I mean, they did very, very careful work and, went through tens of thousands of documents. And it's clear that there was this collaboration between the federal government and these platforms to suppress certain kinds of speech. And so this was, they got away with it because they could say these are private companies, but it's actually the government suppressing speech through private companies. And so it's really not much of a difference from direct suppression of free speech. So there is a danger, obviously, within this country, on both sides of the political spectrum. You just have different victims depending on who's in charge.
Right. The fact that there weren't any repercussions for that, the FBI and CIA, Homeland Security being involved in Facebook and Twitter and suppressing certain information and, giving blacklists to the government, giving blacklists to these companies. Nothing ever happened to the people that did that to the government. So it's just like the fact that there were no repercussions just means it's going to happen again. You just get away with it. So it's like the precedent's been set. We don't, the government can just do whatever it wants with impunity. It doesn't suffer repercussions for anything. That's why this system doesn't work, right? I mean, there has to be some accountability, but it just seems like within the West, there's no accountability. I mean, you're talking about, people being arrested in the UK for like social media posts. I heard, I don't know if it's true, but something like 14,000 people or like in jail in the UK, something like those are political prisoners, right? That's thought police. That's thought speech. You had the wrong thoughts. You go to jail. That's straight up gulag stuff, right? I mean, that's very Soviet and
right. Yeah, I don't know exactly if 14,000 are in jail. I think maybe 14,000 were arrested. Maybe quite a few were released right away. But still, that's chilling. That's pretty scary. Have the police come knock on your door and grab you and take you off to jail. And some people stay there, for a while. There's no question. I don't know exactly what the numbers are. But that there should be a hue and cry about it, But again, our media is the fact that, for example, our media, mainstream media, like the New York Times, just don't seem to be concerned about that. I find that very worrying because it tells you that they really are not concerned about suppression of certain kinds of free speech. So when we get, maybe when the Democrats come back in power and they have people that are aligned with the thinking of, the owners and editors of the New York Times, they can get away with it. They'll go ahead and do these things and they'll be supported by a good part of the fourth estate in our country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the West is becoming more and more Orwellian. It is scary, the trend. Who knows where we're going to be in a couple of years? It's already.
Yeah, I saw actually, I think just this morning, there was a report that a large sum of money, was allocated to a software firm in Spain, I believe in Barcelona, to actually develop a program that would monitor social media posts, looking for basically extremists. People have committed no crimes, have done no, committed no acts, have not supported any kind of violence, but have expressed opinions that are considered to be extremist. And then they're basically put on a watch list. And at some point, the idea is that the government, I think at least the potential is that then you have governments intervene and actually seize people even before they act, which is
it's a Minority Report
stuff. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it is pretty getting crazy out there.
Right. There are genuinely scary opinions that are called extremists, extremist. But then there are opinions like the ones that we're expressing that are firmly based on reality and don't in any way advocate for violence, quite the reverse, and they get categorized as extremists too. That's the problem.
Mm. I wanted to ask you one last thing. Maybe we just touch on it real quick. It's just that about Venezuela, because Trump has announced a complete blockade on sanctioned oil tankers. Is there going to be big implications for this? Do you see Venezuela reacting in some way that could cause some escalation, or is this just going to starve Venezuela?
Yeah, I don't know what they can do, to be honest. Essentially, it's sanctioned oil tankers, I think, is virtually every oil tanker that goes to Venezuela. So it's a sea blockade. It's an act of war. Let's be honest. It's a complete act of war. And, war doesn't necessarily entail dropping bombs and so forth. It can also be economic. And this is an act of war. Probably more people died in Germany, for example, in World War I because of the sea blockade imposed by Great Britain than from actual bullets. And again, we're talking about kids, all kinds of civilians. So he has just declared war against Venezuela, and I don't know what Venezuela can do. Of course, Russia and China and some other countries, typically BRICS countries have spoken out strongly against it, but they're a long ways away, and it's not clear what they can do to help them. And I find very disturbing the complete silence from the Europeans. They're supposed to be all about human rights and whatever, just another reason to be disgusted with them. And in fact, just the opposite. They're celebrating, their Nobel laureate Machado is going to be the replacement, and she's supporting, this military intervention. And then within Latin America, we've talked about the exception of Colombia, but in general, there's just silence. And I find that very disturbing. It's just like, this is wrong. This is just such an obvious act of war. There ought to be protests, especially in Latin America. I think part of the reason is like what I said last time is that Latin America is really split. There's conservatives or the right wing in Latin America, I think, tends to be very pro-U.S. So they're actually in favor of this. So you have recently some pro-U.S. governments have come to power in places like Bolivia and Chile, and they, maybe they haven't stated it in so many words, but I think they support this. I really feel for the Venezuelan people.
So does that just mean that no oil tankers will even attempt now? That they'll just what if Russia and China, they have oil tankers? Would the U.S. dare to intercept a Russian or Chinese oil tanker?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. There was that story. It was actually, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal about a tanker that was boarded, a Chinese tanker that was boarded by the U.S. last month. And
you mentioned that. I haven't looked that story up.
I saw it. It's been mentioned. It was carried, I'm pretty sure, in the Wall Street Journal. And I just wondered, it might be phony. It hasn't been confirmed. And it kind of, I find it hard to believe. And I would be very disappointed if it happened and the Chinese didn't protest.
I don't think it happened.
Because it just seems to me that the Chinese wouldn't just let that happen.
Yeah, I would have. I think I would have seen it, because I check, Zihu, like, Chinese social media daily, for like expat edit for articles that I make, and I feel like that would have been a story that I would have seen trending.
It would be a huge story, it seems to me, and I'm very surprised. I mean, unless for whatever reason the Chinese government decided just to keep quiet and to pretend that it didn't happen. But I don't know why they would do that. That does not seem to be in keeping with the way that they're dealing with the U.S. now. They have been very forthright, and they have not done it. They do not try to appease the U.S. When the U.S. does something against them, they respond in tit for tat fashion, very quickly. So right. I have my suspicions about it.
Yeah, because I see on Chinese social media commentary stuff about like Japan and Taiwan and, hot geopolitical issues that are being discussed with great fervor on Chinese social media. Right. So I feel like I would have seen this, but, it's possible. Yeah. We just have to look at it some more. Yeah, we'll see. This Venezuela thing is just, it's another another real strange situation. We've been there a long time. We're turning the screws. It seems like now we're not even pretending it's about narco-terrorism anymore. It's like, well, it's really about the oil now. It's seize the oil. Yeah. It's like,
and I find it disturbing that there isn't much. You would think that there would be more protests from the left. There are true principled leftists in this country, and they are. They do denounce it. But the liberal establishment maybe says, maybe, it's sort of like tisk tisk, or this is not quite right or something. But it's in general, they don't seem to care very much about it. And that's always been true of the attacks on Venezuela. It was true under past administrations too. It's just like at the highest levels, it seems like when it comes to geopolitics, there's really no difference between left and right in this country.
Yeah, I just feel like there's got to be something that Venezuela could do. Like, is there any way that there could be some type of escort with a tanker? But I know that it's no match for the U.S. Navy, but just the U.S. Navy wouldn't want to engage. I feel like because then we're talking about a real war. Now you just escalated, but maybe that's what the U.S. wants. I mean. You don't think there's anything that Venezuela can do? They're just
Well, it seems to me actually that the U.S. probably doesn't want a war, and that's why this is happening. That's why they've been there for so long. They've been just sort of ratcheting up the pressure, and the hope is that they can get Maduro just to leave. I guess they have a sense they know there are risks to actually, attempting a direct coup or any kind of intervention on land. It could go woefully wrong. These attempts have gone wrong in the past. So they're trying not to. They're doing everything short of it, and this is probably the last move. And if this doesn't succeed, then maybe they will go kinetic, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, this last move is a move that could last a while, right? I mean, like a blockade, but is this blockade, is this a huge cost for us? Or, I mean, we have ships out there patrolling all the time anyway, so it's just like now they're just positioned here.
Right. Well, I think there may be some increase in cost, but you're right. I mean, the ships are out there. They've been diverted from other parts of the world. So there is a cost, but it's nothing like the cost that Venezuela has to sustain. So, if we're talking about competing costs, Venezuela loses. I think there's no question about it.
So are we going to see Venezuelan people, begin to suffer severely? Like we're talking about like potentially starvation. Like how bad can it get if it's from an oil embargo? Like how damaging is this to them?
Right. Well, of course, the country is already suffering under a lot of sanctions. Now, I don't think there's any danger of starvation now. Would there be? Again, it's a large country. It's a tropical country. They may be able to feed themselves, but they might not be able to do a lot more than that. I don't know. No question it's going to increase poverty. Will it actually lead to starvation? Yeah, maybe. It's not a wealthy country. It's poor. People's needs are met, at present, but that is very important income for them. Even though that income has been reduced because of the sanctions over the years, they're still getting enough income to keep a lot of people out of poverty. And now they're not going to have that.
Okay, well, I guess we'll just keep an eye on it. All right, Dad. I think we can end it there.
Okay, sure.
All right. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.